The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, what are the parties promising to do for Ontario's education system? But first, it's the final pre-election edition of On Poly that's coming up next on the agenda.
Hey, JMM, our last one. Apologies for the bad throat off the top for starters. Still haven't recovered from the hockey game.
Which you didn't watch.
Yeah. First of all, what are you wearing today?
This is one of my Star Wars spaceship T-shirts.
Oh, okay.
And
we got to push at the edges of your comfort zone a bit. Maybe get into some different ideas.
Maybe next time I'll find something with a slogan or something.
Okay. Well, I wore today something that I think is appropriate to the occasion, and humor me for a moment as I go through all this. Do you remember a guy named Chris Stockwell?
I do indeed.
Does that name ring a bell? Okay, I met Chris probably 40 years ago when he was a Toronto City Councillor, and I was covering City Hall. And he was a very outspoken, very quotable guy, represented Etobicoke. And I don't know, we got to know each other, and he decided eventually he was going to run provincially, ran in 1995 for Mike Harris. And even though he had a lot of experience in public life, and his dad had been in public life before him, Mike Harris made it a point not to put him in cabinet, and Chris was expecting to get into cabinet. And when Mike called him in for an interview, for a meeting, just to say to him, I'm not putting you in cabinet, he hit the roof. You know, it was like, F you, F this party, F this government, F this whole... Anyway, he went kind of crazy. He eventually, because Mr. Harris lost some cabinet ministers along the way, got into cabinet. He also became the Speaker of the legislature and got a modicum of revenge against the Harris government when he found them in contempt of the legislature on one occasion.
Yes.
He may be, and let's do a little trivia here, he may be best remembered for a moment in 1999, you know, when they went to fewer politicians.
Yes.
So you had, in some cases, two Conservative MPPs running against each other for the nomination.
Yeah.
So there were two Etobicoke MPPs who had to run against each other. You're smiling. You remember who he beat?
Yes, he beat Doug Ford Sr.
That is correct.
Yes.
He beat the Premier's father. So he put an end to Doug Ford Sr.'s political career. Anyways, as the shirt indicates, when Mike Harris stepped down, they had a leadership convention to replace him. Ernie Eves won that convention. Chris Stockwell actually came last. But he had a great campaign. He had a lot of fun. He enjoyed giving the speech. And then shortly thereafter, I remember calling Chris and saying, I'm hearing bad things about you, about your health. What's going on? And he said, I don't believe everything you hear. And not long after that, he died of cancer at the age of 60, which was crazy. Way too young, way too young. And that was 7 years ago this month. So I'm wearing this shirt to remember Chris Stockwell today on the 7th anniversary of his passing. But what a great guy and a fun guy. I remember having him sitting over there on the agenda one day, and he was having a debate with somebody, and he said, you know what, you're backing up so fast from your previous position, I can hear you beeping. And he was that kind of guy. Lots of fun.
And has a terrific portrait at the legislature. If you ever get to go to the legislature, most of the speakers, or many of the speakers, get their portraits, and his is still hanging in the legislature, and it really is one of the better ones at the legislature.
Absolutely right. Okay, let's get on to sort of the news of the week, and which included another trip by Doug Ford to Washington. What came out of that?
Right. So, I mean, there have been criticisms, once again, of the Premier traveling during a election campaign. Allegations that, this is kind of just a showboat maneuver by the provincial Premier as well. There isn't exactly... how to put this, unambiguous leadership from the federal level. Ford, for his part, says that he believes that the premiers are moving the needle. They're, meeting with governors. This was a strategy that both federal and provincial politicians used during the first Trump administration, right? If you're not getting anywhere with the White House, talk to governors, talk to representatives, talk to senators, and work on the relationships there. Again, I think not clear that it's having a lot of effect, but in part that's because the Trump White House is so chaotic. They say one thing one day, another thing the next day.
You don't say.
And sometimes two completely different things within the same day. So very hard to judge whether that's actually having any progress. Perhaps the most notable thing has been that we did get an indication of the enforcement of the Caretaker Convention. We have talked about this at length in the podcast, the idea that the government stays the government during an election campaign, but isn't supposed to use all of their powers for their own partisan benefit. And so last week we learned that Michelle D'Emmanuel, who is the Secretary of Cabinet, this is the highest ranking Ontario civil servant, she read the Riot Act a little bit.
Wrapped his knuckles a bit.
Yes, specifically for the ad that the PC party cut after the first trip to Washington that ended with the partisan logo emblazoned at the end of the ad. That ad was taken down. They republished it without the partisan messaging. But D'Emmanuel more or less said, like, hey, like, this is not cool. Knock that off. And she did also criticize the government for designating campaign staffers as government officials for the trip. They were incorrectly classified. You know, I mentioned this not just because it was news and it was worth mentioning, but when we talk about a convention, I think people sometimes ask, like, okay, but whose job is it to enforce this rule, right? And the thing about conventions, what makes them distinct from laws and regulations is that it is not the court's jobs or the police or government regulators to enforce these rules. These conventions get enforced in a different way. And here, it's the Secretary of Cabinet who, is the one responsible for enforcing the Caretaker Convention. And here we see Michelle D'Emmanuel rising to that task. We know that she did this in part because Liberal, I guess he was the leader in the House in the previous legislature, but Liberal MPP John Fraser wrote a letter to her, and her response to Mr. Fraser then made it to newspapers.
It does get a little awkward because, of course, Michelle D'Emmanuel has her job because Doug Ford appointed her to that position. Yes. And she's now in a position of having to give him HE double hockey sticks for what he transgressed on. So awkward, yes? Yes,
you can imagine that's a bit awkward, and yet at the same time, I would say certainly Ms. D'Emmanuel has demonstrated her qualities by not letting the fact that Doug Ford appointed her to this position get in the way of enforcing the rules.
Right on. And with that, I'm going to enforce the rules and get us to issue 1. On the last Monday before Election Day, the Progressive Conservative Party released its platform outlining $40 billion in spending promises. JM is going to walk us through some of those highlights. $40 billion. You like that number, first of all?
Yeah, well, let's start with that number. Mm-hmm. So this is the figure provided by the PC party, but they did not release anything that I think you could fairly call a detailed costing of their platform. If you are the kind of voter for whom a detailed costing is really important to you, I think I could say without fear of bias that the Green Party really is the front runner in terms of having released the most detailed costing. The Liberals and NDP released their platforms on Friday. They attached costings. I would say they were not as detailed as the Green Party. And the PC party has, frankly, barely published a costing at all. Some of the most expensive promises that they have made in their platform cannot possibly be included in that $40 billion figure. I mentioned, of course, the tunnel under the 401. That would almost as a physical law would need to cost more than $40 billion. Therefore, the fact that the PC party is saying $40 billion in spending, they must not be including all of that construction cost in this platform costing.
No, fair enough. But, well, let's put it this way. Is there anything new at all in this platform?
It was very much a collection of the promises that have been made this far in the campaign. I don't want to be overly uncharitable, but at one point I kind of imagined, some PC staffer just stapling all the old press releases together. There were, however, some new items. The government is proposing to eliminate the minimum price for liquor at the LCBO. The government used to have a minimum price for beer. You might recall that the Premier promised to bring back buck a beer in his first government. They are now proposing to eliminate the minimum price for alcohol at the LCBO. This is a policy that the LCBO uses to moderate people's consumption, frankly, right? It's part of what they call their social responsibility policy. The Premier asked about this, said, like, this policy doesn't really exist in other provinces. Why are we still doing it here in Ontario? It's actually not clear to me that that's correct, that I think there are still some other provinces that moderate prices this way, but regardless, the Premier says it's time to get rid of that. Probably the most interesting elements of the platform, to me anyway, were two big things that were missing. First of all, nowhere in the document will you see the PC party commit to building 1.5 million new homes by 2031.
And that has been a signature promise for years.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's substantial government policy that is built around cajoling, prodding, pleading with municipalities to get more homes built, get more building permits issued, that kind of thing, all wrapped around this idea of getting 1.5 million new homes built by 2031. That promise is not in the platform. Premier asked about it, first said, well, we're working with municipalities to streamline applications. And that's true. They are doing that work. And even before the election, they were announcing substantial amounts of money to encourage municipalities to improve infrastructure that homes need, things like plumbing and roads. But yeah, at least in the text of the platform, that promise is no longer there. Also missing, no pledge to balance the budget over the next 4 years. I note this because the fall economic statement and the budget from last year both talked about a path to balance, and the budget is cautious, right? The budget talks about, like, okay, well, if the economy is very good, then we could get to balance faster. And if it's not so good, then it might take us longer. But there was a path to balance. The Premier asked about this omission in the platform, said basically, we don't know. With Trump's tariffs, if the economic hit that poses to the Ontario economy, we not only would that be such a hit to our revenues, we would need to spend so much to support businesses and workers that, he compared it to COVID, right? He's saying more or less, if these tariffs do in fact arrive, we will necessarily go back into deficit, or rather, we are already in deficit. We will go into a more substantial deficit, and yet no promise to balance the budget between now and the next 4 years.
And with that, we're off to issue 2. There are two pretty reliable ways to figure out what the state of play is in an election campaign. Number 1, check the polls. Number 2, check where the leaders are spending their time. If they're going to places where they already had seats in the last House, it shows potentially a lack of confidence in picking up new seats. Conversely, if you're going to places that your opponent held in the last House, that suggests you think you've got a shot to pick up new seats. So let's see who's where. What do you want to tell us?
Right. So we have Doug Ford is making a campaign stop in Ottawa today with another round of endorsements expected. Marit Stiles is in London, Waterloo, Kitchener, and Scarborough, really barnstorming there. Bonnie Crombie was also in Scarborough today. And Mike Schreiner is in Huntsville campaigning in Parry Sound, Muskoka with his candidate there, Matt Richter, who came second back in 2022.
Let's follow up on a couple of these things here. Marit Stiles of the NDP, she has really had a punishing schedule over the last week or so. She has been to, and I made a list of it here, Beaches, East York, in hoping to take that one out of the Liberal column from the last House, but also Brampton, Hamilton, Kitchener, Brantford, Kingston, Ottawa, Peterborough, Bowmanville, Windsor, Sarnia, and London. She's been doing 3, 4, sometimes 5 events a day, far more than any of the other leaders. And interestingly, yes, most of those seats, most of those places that she went to were Tory-held ridings in the last House, but some of them are Liberal seats as well. Kingston, for example, was a Liberal-held seat. So I remember having her in here last week, and she was saying, we're going after the Conservatives. Well, not totally. She's actually going after the Liberals on some seats as well. Having said that, I note with interest Bonnie Crombie was here in our riding, Toronto St. Paul's, where this TV station is. She was just there the other day. The NDP won that seat the last 2 elections, both close races both times. So perhaps the Liberals are thinking that the leader's presence for a day in the riding might help tip it over to the Liberal side of things. She also, Crombie did, a stop in Mississauga, which I think could be interpreted one of two ways. Number one, of course, she's from Mississauga, wants to get elected in Mississauga, so let's show the flag in Mississauga. Makes sense. On the other hand, if you're in the last week of a campaign and you really have to, as the expression goes, husband your time and resources well, why are you going to a place that you think you're a slam dunk to win? Maybe it suggests they don't think it's a slam dunk to win. Anyway, she's running in Mississauga, East Cooksville, and we'll know in a couple of days the results of all of that.
Right. We also mentioned Doug Ford being in Ottawa, and I just want to remind the audience that the national capital was really one of the few parts of this province where the PC party really struggled in the last few years. They lost one seat in the 2022 election with Jeremy Roberts losing to New Democrat Chandra Pasma in Ottawa West Nepean. Then Marilee Fullerton resigned her seat unexpectedly in 2023. The eventual by-election in Canada Carleton was won by Karen McCrimmon, the Liberal. Mm-hmm. Those defeats, combined with the fact that the Premier didn't seem overly fond of his remaining Ottawa area MPPs, meant that there was this odd fact that the National Capital Region didn't really have any representation in Doug Ford's cabinet, and then he appointed a kind of Premier's advisor for the National Capital Region, and that became a whole issue. So one thing that Ford and the PC party will be trying to do in this election is just to build up their bench strength around Ottawa, and they are probably not going to win in Ottawa Centre, for example, where we expect that to be a Liberal NDP race, but seats around the Ottawa region that they can potentially, maybe not immediately, but potentially elevate somebody to cabinet, and that person would be Ottawa's voice in the government.
Because I just wrote a column about the race happening in Ottawa Centre, which I think will go up tomorrow, this is in my brain. Ottawa Centre, the current boundary ridings, so it's 25 years, right?
Something like
25 years since 1999, only ever been won by the Liberals and New Democrats, and it's almost even. It's one of them has won it for maybe 2 years more than the other. Right. The Conservatives have never won it.
Yeah.
So Catherine McKinney is running for the NDP in this one.
Yeah.
People will remember her. They ran for mayor, I guess, against Mark Sutcliffe and lost. Yeah. Anyway, that column will be up in a couple of days. No, tomorrow. That column will be up tomorrow, and people can check that out.
That's the final of your columns,
yes,
looking
right.
at all of the star candidates.
From the four different major parties, that's right. Now, we do have an interesting question here from Matthew O'Meara, our producer, who wanted to ask, has there ever been a time where two party leaders have duked it out in the same single riding? Or would that be too big of a risk? And the answer is...
Is it yes?
Oh, absolutely, it's yes.
I was racking my brain when I saw this question in the script, and I genuinely...
Oh, you know what? That's a great question. Now, okay, the first thing that popped into my head was John Tory against Kathleen Wynne, but she wasn't the leader yet.
No, okay.
She wasn't the leader yet. He was the leader of the Ontario PC party, but she was not yet the leader of the provincial Liberals.
But an interesting race there, because part of what was going on in that contest was John Tory believing that it was really important that the PC party be competitive in Toronto again, which it had not been for multiple cycles at that point.
4 straight elections.
And would not again be competitive really until 2018. And needless to say, Kathleen Wynne won her seat in Don Valley West. John Tory did not win, and that posed problems for him later in his political career.
Well, I think you could say it contributed to the end of his political career provincially.
Yes.
But of course, opened a new door for him in radio and then municipally.
Yes, he would then go on to be mayor.
But have two party leaders ever gone against each other in the same riding? I can't think of a single example.
No, and I went through the, admittedly, I'm not going to claim that this was extensive research, but I did try and go through the list of like Liberal and PC leaders to see if any of them competed in the same riding at the same time. There might have been a smaller party that had a leader who competed against one of the larger ones. I wasn't able to find them. If somebody knows the answer to this, by all means, write in and tell us, because I would love to know.
As would I. And with that, off to issue 3. Last week was the 2025 Ontario election candidates debate on disability issues. Marjorie Knight, the NDP's candidate in Cambridge, Catherine McGarry, Liberal Party president, and Ignacio Mongrel for the Greens in University Rosedale. They were the 3 protagonists. The Progressive Conservatives, now who represented the Progressive Conservatives at this debate? No one.
An empty chair.
Because they never sent anybody, I shouldn't say never. Donna Skelly from Flamborough, Glanbrook, took part in a Cable 14 debate in Hamilton. She's the only PC party candidate I know of out of 124 in the whole province who has bothered to take part in a local all-candidates debate, either related to a riding or related to an issue. All the PC candidates dodged the debates. You could say that's shameful. I would never say such a thing. But you could say that's shameful. Anyways. Okay, let's get into it. What came up in the disability issues?
Well, I want to say very briefly, I think that it's easy to assume that disability issues or accessibility issues broadly are a niche concern. And I will just say that I was really radicalized on accessibility issues when my child was born, and the first several winters pushing a stroller around the streets of Toronto in the winter, in much the same condition as they are right now as we record this podcast, just a total disaster, right? The sidewalks are never clear. You're pushing a heavy stroller and a kid through, impossible streets. And then even if you get indoors into various malls or public places, you suddenly become aware in a way that I certainly never was before, as I say, before having a kid, that steps and stairs, and there are all sorts of obstacles to just moving freely around the city.
Let me put two wrinkles on this. Number one, or if you're a senior with a walker, same thing. And I learned about this very carefully 20 plus years ago. I had bad back problems. I needed a walker to get around. And I just found how absolutely non-navigable much of our capital city is for people with disabilities, because I was a person with a disability at that time. It was a nightmare trying to get around. Anyway, so that's why these issues are important.
Yes.
There's lots of people dealing with those kinds of issues. What do the parties have to say in this debate?
Right. So the opposition parties all are proposing to substantially increase ODSP payments, with the New Democrats, Liberals and Greens all in their platform saying that they would double ODSP rates. This is the Ontario Disability Support Plan or Payment. Apologies, program. I always forget. But this is the primary form of social assistance we provide as a province to people with disabilities. Green leader Mike Schreiner has referred to the current rates as legislated poverty, because ODSP recipients get an income that is substantially lower than the poverty line, and then if they try to make any income on top of their ODSP payments, they face clawbacks for their benefits if they make more than $1,000 a month from other sources.
Sounds like that kind of defeats the point of the whole thing, but anyway.
Well, exactly, right? The way it's currently structured, a person on ODSP faces just really impossible choices.
So what do the parties have on offer in terms of either on top of increasing ODSP, beyond that?
Right. So the NDP have talked about providing rent supplements. They would also crack down on out-of-control rent increases. That's obviously an issue for lots of tenants, but if you are living with a disability and you have found a home that works for you, the prospect of losing that home when you have a set of supports built around that home, that can be very difficult, obviously. The Green Party has talked about streamlining application processes for supports. The Liberals are talking about increasing supports for supportive housing. I would say, broadly speaking, a lot of the opposition parties seem to all be singing out of the same hymn book, a lot of similar ideas.
No Tory representative at this debate, but what does that party have to say anyway?
Well, in the platform, they do talk about increasing ODSP with inflation, something that they have done in government, and increasing that exemption. It used to be, this was the income exemption for clawbacks, used to be $200 a month. They did increase it to $1,000 a month. The party is still very focused on the idea of incentivizing work, and the Premier has talked about, if you're on ODSP but you are able to work, we want to encourage that kind of income. The whole idea of just clawing back that income in the first place is, of course, this idea of saving taxpayer money. But there's an interesting debate happening within the conservative space. There are conservatives out there who argue that these clawbacks basically function like a massive income tax and disincentivize people who would otherwise work from doing so. I have no idea how that debate is going to play out as we go forward in Ontario, but it's the kind of context I like to provide. when I can.
Because these issues are very important, we had David Lepofsky on the agenda last night, so we should, I think we're going to have in the show notes a link to that interview with David Lepofsky, because frankly, we all need to know more about this. This was the year, right? 2025 was the year that Ontario was supposed to be barrier-free as legislated.
I shouldn't laugh, but yeah.
Spoiler alert, we're not there yet.
Yeah.
So we had David on last night talking about the fact that when this law was passed by the Ontario legislature unanimously a quarter century ago, it looked quite hopeful and optimistic at the time. And unfortunately, I think that a lot of those hopes have been dashed by our lack of progress to date.
So much work left to do.
Indeed. Okay. That is the On Poly podcast for this February 25th, 2025, our last episode before the election. Remember, polls open at 9 a.m. and close at 9 p.m. on Thursday. That's Election Day. And the agenda will provide full coverage of Election Day starting at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and will stay on the air until after the last speech of the night is given. JMM and I will co-anchor the coverage, and we'll have lots of special guests join us throughout the night. And then join us again on Friday night for On Poly, where we will wrap it all up and put a bow on it.
You can follow our show on Apple Podcasts so you get notified each time a new episode is available. And you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Any feedback you have, we're always happy to hear it, good, bad, or indifferent. Write us an email at onpolitics@tvo.org. Please be sure to include your first and last name and where you're located. I want to thank the crew for making our video podcast happen, and let's do one special shout out today to somebody who is leaving us next week and who will no longer be with us, therefore, to take us into the future. But Sloan Westlake, we want to thank you for everything you've done for our program. We want to give the best to you, your family, and the East Lakes on the other side of the lake, if that makes any sense. Until next Friday, everybody, the day after Election Day, bye-bye.
Bye.
Classroom sizes, staff shortages, and a repair backlog, all in the aftermath of a devastating pandemic for student learning. I think it's fair to say Ontario's education system is facing major challenges this election. Have the PCs done enough? And what do other parties have to offer? And are we paying enough attention to a system that accounts for almost a fifth of Ontario's budget? Well, let's find out. From Scarborough, Ontario, we're joined by Kristen Rashowi, the Queen's Park reporter for the Toronto Star. And here in studio, we have Annie Kidder, Executive Director and founder of People for Education. And Kelly Gallagher-Mackay is also with us, Associate Professor of Law and Society at Wilfrid Laurier University. Thank you all for being here. Well, in the interest of full disclosure, TVO is an agency of the Ministry of Education and has been part of the province's delivery of distance learning since it was created back in 1970. Today, TVO offers online secondary school courses through the Independent Learning Centre and has been asked by the province to develop online courses for use by secondary schools right across the province. So we care about education here. Kelly, let me start with you. In an election, there is so much the leaders are pushing. There's so much to focus on. Do you think education has successfully been on the radar?
I think that education is a huge part of daily life, but it's not a huge part of political conversation in Ontario today. And when you talk to people who are in schools, whether that be students or educators or parents who are deeply concerned, there's a lot of concerns that schools aren't doing the job and they aren't getting the serious attention they need to thrive and support our kids to be ready for a big, scary future.
Annie, last time you were on the show, I understand you said we are not paying enough attention to education. Why is the political discourse not around education?
Well, it's kind of a great question, and there have been provincial and territorial elections that have been happening across Canada, and education has never been sort of one of the top issues, except for some kind of semi-controversial parts. So I think as a society, we have a tendency to sort of take our public schools for granted, even though more than 90% of our kids go to them. We don't understand the kind of foundational job they do in our social and economic future, and we just sort of go, they're there, whatever, they're not sexy, maybe even not not as sexy as post-secondary education. So they don't seem to, except in a crisis like the pandemic, when they were in the news every day, they don't seem to get on the radar as a fundamental issue, which to me is even more amazing right now when the world is so messy. And obviously, I think we really should be paying attention to our schools as a place where we could be building more resilience in this sort of messy world.
Kristen, I wonder if it's because of our neighbors to the south. I mean, does Trump everything?
I mean, this election has been all about Trump and tariffs. I mean, that's why Premier Doug Ford called the election. He said he needed a 4-year mandate to fight Trump and the threat of tariffs. So that has really taken up a lot of the oxygen in this election. And I think, too, you know, there really isn't, as Annie said, there isn't some big controversy at the moment that the education system is dealing with in a way that, you know, parents are super engaged about. I mean, I think, you know, in the past, we've seen things like, you know, John Tory in 2007, he was talking about funding for more religious schools. We had sex ed, pandemic, things like that. I mean, this time, you know, teachers have contracts. They have signed contracts with the government. So, and there's also been mostly labor peace in the last few years. So there's not that also sort of prompting parents to pay attention and prompting people to pay attention to the education system. And really, we haven't seen much talk of it at all. Bonnie Crombie, the Ontario Liberal leader, held a press conference, I believe it was last week, talking about post-secondary. But really, we haven't seen talk about K-12 at all in this election.
I mean, how do you do that, though? I think about the times when education was making waves. Sex ed curriculum in 2018, John Tory in 2007 when he talked about extending funding to faith-based schools. How do you do that, Kelly? Like, how do you make it a more of a priority without something that is so controversial that's riling people up?
I think it's tricky because we want to take education for granted. We want to be confident that our kids are going to good schools that are in good shape and that are working well. And, you know, in some ways, no news means that we're not freaking out about something. But you notice that those issues aren't about the daily work of schools. The ones that typically make the headlines are a piece of the puzzle, but they're sort of around the edges. The daily work of schools for the average Canadian, I would say, is almost like a bit of a black box. You don't know what it is that actually makes a difference to make schools work better for all kids. And when people don't know, they don't think about it. That's my guess.
So it sometimes might be a good sign if people aren't that concerned.
I don't think it's necessarily a good sign. I think there's maybe a sense that they don't know what to do about it.
Okay.
That I think people have a lot of concerns right now. You talk to educators, you talk to parents. I wouldn't say anyone's happy. But is there a quick political fix that people can get behind? Harder to get that.
Let me ask then, because the pandemic has really disrupted education in our province. Students are struggling still. Kelly, let me ask, how would you characterize a system of K-12 right now in Ontario?
Well, I would characterize it as a system that is really struggling. And I think there's two things I'd point to in particular. The number one is staff shortages. You know, we aren't hiring enough educators and we aren't keeping the ones we have. People are very unhappy with feeling disrespected and leaving the profession in droves. And so the principals announced last year, they did a survey, more than half of principals have unqualified staff in front of their students on a regular basis. So that's a really big problem and they're having to cover. So we're losing special ed teachers to cover classrooms where teachers are missing. So teacher shortage and attendance. There's a shortage of children in our schools. And that has historically, when kids are missing a lot of school, when there's something called chronic absenteeism happening, that has a big long-term impact on kids' learning and outcomes. It means they're more likely to drop out, less likely to go to post-secondary. It's one of the biggest predictors of long-term futures. And right now we're seeing attendance problems like we've never seen before.
Wow, that is a huge issue. Annie and Kristen, I know you've been talking to principals. You brought up principals across the province. Annie, let me start with you. What have you been hearing?
Well, I think like Kelly, and we've actually been talking to principals across the country, and I think what's interesting is it's the same story across the country. So huge worries about staff shortages, but also a feeling that they're dealing with an incredible amount of kind of stress and that nobody cares. Like there is a kind of, cry into the wilderness there from people working inside schools going, why isn't the world more concerned about what's happening in our schools? And again, I think it's really important to note this is across the country. So people working inside schools are dealing with a lack of staff. They're feeling a sense that kids are more troubled now than they used to be. Maybe since time immemorial we've said that about kids, but I think it's really true now. And again, this is true across the country. So for people working in schools, there's a level of stress and a desire to support kids, to be able to ensure that they're able to be well at school, but not a sense that they're being supported from the outside. And I think it's really, to me, this isn't about money, it's about something else. But yeah, that's the story from inside schools. Lots of stress and not a feeling that the world outside is caring enough.
Not enough support. So Kristen, in your reporting on education, do you find there's one issue that keeps pervasively coming up?
I would definitely say it's the teacher shortage. That is the one issue that you hear from teachers, support staff, and principals as well. Last week we saw a joint statement put out by all of the teacher unions and the principals' councils, and they were saying, look, they're trying to get education on the agenda. They're talking about lack of teachers, lack of qualified personnel, lack of people, lack of supports in schools, violence in schools, which has been a big campaign by the unions talking about the need for more supports for special needs students in schools. They talk about underfunding of, per student funding going down. These are all things that they are dealing with on a day-to-day basis. Unfortunately, these issues have all been crowded out because, it's Trump and tariffs. That's everything that people are focusing on, as well as affordability. So those are the issues that are taking up the public's attention right now, and not these other issues that, are critical for our schools.
We're talking about schools, so I want to talk about grades. Kelly, what grade would you give this government in terms of education?
I give them a C, and honestly, that's a bit of a carryover from the pandemic, where I think they failed very deeply. There's lots of research that's come out over the long term, in the post-pandemic moment, saying schools that were closed the longest are doing the worst, serve their students the worst. And I don't think we've made any serious commitment to catch up or cover. It's like, let's pretend that didn't happen. And when you look at life on the ground in schools, it's very clear that pandemic is having lasting effects on all students, particularly students facing extra challenges, and families and stress. That elements of stress and well-being, I think, were accelerated by the pandemic and haven't been wrestled with.
Kristen, I'm going to come to you. Grade for this government.
Well, you know what? It depends on who you talk to. I think the teacher unions and the labor unions would not be very happy with this government. I think school boards as well, they're the ones who've identified that, yes, funding has gone up every year under this government, but it has not kept pace with inflation. And I think the figure they've landed on is about $1,500 per student that they're behind. They also need funding for things like CPP or EI, employment income increases, that is beyond their control, that has not been funded. And I think they've pegged that at about $100 million shortfall. So for school boards, also very frustrating. I think the government has made some moves that people do like, de-streaming. That's for programs and for high school students so that they're not streamed out of a university or college stream so early on. That's a good move. Was there enough funding that came with it? I think teachers would say no. The government's also focused on math and STEM and things like that, sort of a back to basics. They've introduced reading screening in early years, which I think universally people do like. But again, though, I think it all comes down to the funding and the teacher shortage. I think that's probably the one thing you'd hear from parents, that it's rotating teachers. They can't get supply teachers. They can't get qualified teachers. They don't have a teacher in their classroom. I mean, there was one group in Toronto where the parents posted on social media to try and find a teacher for their kids' classroom. So I think if you talk to those parents, not so happy.
So it depends who you ask. That would be their grade. Annie, do you have a grade?
I don't have a grade, but I do think in an election where we're talking about Trump and tariffs, and this is also true across Canada, that what we don't have from anybody is a kind of new vision to go, if this is the world we're living in, if that's the reality in our neighbors to the south, what do we need to be doing really deeply differently in our schools so that we're really truly preparing kids for a future that we're unsure about, but we actually know, I think, a lot about what could and should change in terms of what kinds of skills should they be getting, what needs to change in terms of curriculum. So right now, I don't think that there's anybody out there bravely going, we need actually a whole new vision for education that deals with the reality of the world we're living in now, and make sure that in Canada, which is feeling kind of insecure right this minute, rightfully so, we're thinking about how much we're building our next generation and how much all of our future depends on what we do in our schools. And I think that's not the message that's getting out that should be.
Well, let's take a look at some of the promises in the platforms, what the vision is right now. The PC's saying it will invest $1.3 billion more to build 30 new schools and expand 15. They plan to cut red tape and standardize designs to build schools faster. They also say they will introduce a comprehensive plan to reduce distractions in the classroom. Let's go to the NDP. They say they will add $1,500 in funding per student. It will spend roughly $830 million more per year to clear the school repair list. It plans to hire more staff in schools, including child and youth workers, and end streaming, what Kristen talked about there, which is making students choose applied or academic tracks. The Liberals, here's their plan to add $1,500 in funding per student, same as the NDP. The party wants to clear the school repair backlog. It also wants to eliminate portables by building 90 new schools over 4 years. It also pledges to hire more education workers and mental health professionals. The Greens, they pledged to add $1,500 as well in funding per student. The party also wants to clear the school repair backlog. That's a big one. It will provide enhanced funding to end streaming, and the Greens will also cap class sizes in kindergarten and grades 4 to 8. Annie, let me start with you. What sticks out to you in those platforms?
So much conversation about money and not necessarily a conversation about what should we be doing in our schools, for having that first and then going, and what should we be spending on it. That has been a problem for every government we've had since I've been doing this work, which is nearly 30 years, is that we always start with the money and we don't start with what are we trying to do, what are we trying to accomplish, what do all kids need, how do we make sure that we're doing all the sort of health promotion, prevention work really, really early on. That's what's not there, I don't think, in any of the platforms. And it's always been a problem, because then when we're communicating to the rest of the world about education, and the rest of the world counts because they vote, so you have to convince the rest of the voters this is worth spending money on and caring about, we have to communicate something more than, $1,500 or something more than money. We have to communicate something that has more hope and a kind of vision for the future.
The language isn't there for you. Kelly,
the vision isn't
the
there.
vision and the language, all of it. Yeah. Kelly, for you.
Well, beyond those specific points, when you do look at the platforms from the different parties, there's a lot of talk about the basics, right? We're going to get back to basics as Tory language. We're going to get the basics right as Liberal language. And I think that there's really reason to be concerned that we do want the floor. Like, nobody doesn't want the basics done well,
right.
But I guess this is a bit like Annie. When I think about my kids, I want them to learn a lot more than the basics. I don't think the basics is good enough for our kids. And that's not just sort of a comfy middle class perspective. I think for all our kids, we need to hope for a lot more than the basics out of our schools. And we need to support the people who are doing the work so that they can do that meaningfully and well. And so, you look at something like extracurriculars. There are some things that students love best, where they grow the most, do the most creativity and social emotional learning. Well, we don't even support that. We assume teachers are going to volunteer, and when you have a burnt out workforce, you get less volunteering and you get less texture around the school. We need more than the basics for our kids.
And can I add to that? I think that one of what's really important in there too is that there's no breathing room anymore. So that if you are a teacher, an educational assistant, whoever, a principal, all the people doing support work, there's no room to have any kind of autonomy to go, I'm going to make my classroom like this, or there isn't that freedom there. So you end up focusing on the basics, which again are obviously
which you
important.
need to get right.
Obviously you do. I think that part goes without saying. But now we're kind of cramming forward so that there's not that space, which is partly what leads to the stress, partly what leads to the disengagement of kids. And that's again why it's important that we're talking about this beyond money and about something bigger than that.
I take your point, Annie, that it's not just about money. But Chris, I'm curious to know how much of the issues that we're facing still come down to dollar signs. And when you're reporting and talking to people in communities, like, do they care about those dollar signs when they're put up there in these platforms?
Well, it's interesting because sort of the days of the fully costed platform from campaigns are pretty much over. We saw that in the last couple of elections, and this one for sure. I mean, these are not fully costed platforms. Maybe because education's not been in the spotlight, it allows them to be a bit more vague on the details. But I mean, I look at these and yes, there are some dollar figures, but if they're talking about more staffing, okay, over what period of time, how many staffers are we talking about? And where do you find them? I mean, there is a teacher shortage at the moment. So where are you going to find them? The Liberals are the only ones talking about shortening the teacher education program to 1 year. It was made 2 years, about 10 years ago, I think, just because there was a glut of teachers and there were no jobs. But now we were in the opposite situation. So the Liberals are saying, let's go back to 1 year. But, that also poses some problems. A lot of universities have made those education programs master's programs, which you can't do in a year. The other thing is teachers need time to learn the new math curriculum. They've got a math test they have to pass before they finish teachers college. So there's lots of issues like that need to be sorted out as well. So it's not clear to me how quickly these things can be implemented when there are things like the teacher shortage that need to be addressed immediately.
At the end of the day, it's students that are affected, and I think about special needs students especially that would need extra help. Kelly, how are they being supported in the classroom right now?
Well, I think there's been a move towards inclusion, which by and large serves students with disabilities well, right? We know that if you put kids off in a room somewhere else, they're less likely to learn as much, and they're less likely to get the opportunities that students with similar achievement would get. So inclusion in general is a great principle, but it's pretty clear that students aren't getting the support they need, and that goes beyond the education system, right? If students need supports and helps and assessment, and they need mental health support that comes from outside the school, but there's a 2-year waiting list for those supports or a 1-year waiting list for those supports, the teachers get them while they're not getting help.
Right.
So the school lives in a bigger world, and when all the other pieces, when housing is hard, that's very hard on families. If they're moving more, if they're struggling to, when mental health services are absent and the connections between mental health services and the schools are bad, that has a big effect on the school in general, and particularly on students who are most vulnerable. And I would say, if you look at the global research around the pandemic, students with disabilities were among the most affected groups, and we don't track how that group is doing relative to others, but it would be surprising. And the way the government dealt with it was spending not nearly enough money on a tutoring program that wasn't targeted to need. We don't do a very good job of saying students need a bit more help in this way, and making sure that it's happening and holding itself accountable for delivering the support students actually need.
Yeah, the mental health side, Annie, is huge.
It is huge. And I think it's, again, we've got a kind of generational mental health. Well, I think all of our mental health is suffering a little bit right now. But when we look at young people and all of the reports, they're pretty unanimous saying kids are really in trouble right now. So their reports of anxiety, depression, all of those things, really, really worrying. I think that the mistake that we're making right now, and again, this is across the country, is what we do is we end up spending money on supports once kids are already in trouble. So we go, okay, we got to spend more on mental illness or supports for kids who are struggling. And what we're not doing is looking at all the evidence, of which there is lots, to say, how do we ensure they don't end up struggling with their mental health? So what are the kind of preventions that we could be doing? If we think of how people talk about health and they go, we have an illness model, we spend billions and billions of dollars on hospitals and not enough money on health promotion and illness prevention. So it's the same with schools, and there's lots of evidence about what we could be doing differently. Again, though, we need more breathing room with kids early on to understand themselves, others, relationships, conflict, being able to persist, be resilient, all of those things. Those are teachable, learnable skills that have to be taught and learned early so that you don't end up in quite the level of distress that we're seeing now.
Kristen, I want to quickly come to you on streaming, because both the NDP and the Greens have said they would end it. Just give our viewers an idea of exactly what streaming is, the pros and cons on there.
Well, I mean, Annie's probably the best person to talk about that, because she did a huge report on the effects of streaming and how, students who it was an applied versus academic level classes, more hands-on versus more academic classes. It was actually shown, and Annie, I'm sure, can speak to this, that kids who took applied level classes were not going on to university. I mean, even I think taking one basically ruled university out for them. So the government did move to de-stream these classes so that students aren't sort of put into this box so early on. And I think Ontario was one of the last jurisdictions to have streaming so early, but, had all kinds of detrimental effects for kids. And that's something that the government has ended for grades 9 and 10. I think the Toronto District School Board, which is one of the largest boards in North America, started a little bit early with things like math, French, I know for sure, things like that. But yeah, this is something that all the parties are moving towards. And certainly this was something that the Conservative government, to its credit, did put in place. But again, it was without the supports that teachers said they needed.
Annie wants to jump in on that.
Well, because they didn't totally officially end it for grade 10. Boards have ended it for grade 10. So it's still, and really the issue is, how do we keep as many doors open as possible for kids all the way through school? So lots of people say kind of unconscious streaming starts happening anyway in elementary school, but kids are still streamed. They're streamed in grade 10 and after grade 10. So what we're not doing is ensuring that our schools, our public schools, are making sure that all kids have as many kind of pathways forward as they can. Because again, messy world, rapidly changing world, kids making choices when they're 14 and 15 that are going to affect their whole lives, because they weren't just going to university, they weren't going to college either. So the evidence was so strong, and it was also the kids who were already at a disadvantage were even more disadvantaged by it. So we've got to see this as a core issue in education, that equity is like part of the fundamental purpose of public education, is that every kid gets a fair chance. And, it's great that people are paying attention to it now, but it needs to be built in all the way through. We need to be thinking about it in many different ways.
Yeah. And if I can throw in two more words, if you think of the end of high school, we call it university and college courses. We keep separating kids by presumed ability or destination. We don't provide students or families with information about the outcomes of those choices. And in fact, they're misleadingly labeled, because, 70% of students who go on to post-secondary don't take any college courses. A whole lot of, the college courses in particular are misleadingly labeled, because kids who take mostly college courses don't go on to post-secondary, including apprenticeships and trades, which we don't track the progress into that. If we cared about it, we'd pay attention about what's happening in terms of getting people into the skilled trades.
Interesting. Okay. Glad we brought out streaming. It was an important one. Okay. If education does not move the needle during elections, how else can we really hold the government accountable for decisions on a file that accounts for 17.5% of Ontario's entire budget? I don't know if everybody knows that. Annie.
Okay, well, this is what we're working on in my organization. We're actually talking about this across the country, and we're going, how do we build a whole new kind of outside of government framework with policy recommendations, so it will be easy to hold all kinds of governments to account, to go, these are the kinds of goals we think should be there, this is how we think you could get there, and we want you to report on how you're doing. So we've seen bits and pieces of that, but we have to be holding them to account for more than just test scores and the basics. We have to really hold them to account for what is your vision? So if we think of, and I'm not equating this at all, but if we think of the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission or the Sustainable Development Goals, they were very defined, very clear. This is what we need in terms of vision. And so that's all of our job, I think, on working with people inside education and outside education to go, what should we be doing to name that new vision, but in a very concrete way so that we can hold governments to account in a new way.
Kristen, let me come to you on that. How do we hold the government accountable when it's, not the top issue in the election?
I think a lot of it is going to be parent pressure. I mean, we saw parent pressure. Parents wanted smaller class sizes. Past governments have delivered. I think we're seeing parents speaking out now about the teacher situation and, the rotating core of teachers that their kids are experiencing and how they're frustrated with that. We also have teacher contracts that will be coming up in 2026. That's another opportunity for the unions to push for things that they really want in contracts, more staffing, different working conditions and things like that. So I think we've got a couple of opportunities coming up, but in the end, it will come down to parents, I think, and educators speaking out about the experiences that they're having in schools.
Kelly, last word.
Well, it's hard.
No pressure.
Because, and I'm going to be really nerdy here and say we don't have the basic data on education in this province. It's not, they actually take data away from us. We used to be able to analyze things by school income. That's now hidden in a file you need to apply for. So I think we need a lot more timely, transparent data from across the school system so that people see what's going on. I think we need goals that stretch further out because K-12 matters for kids' experiences, for their learning, but it also matters for their future. So if we know that post-secondary, including skilled trades, leads to longer, happier, wealthier lives, why isn't that our goal and why aren't we tracking who's making it there? So I would put a call out for data. If we were going to try and hold people accountable, we need more information on what's going on inside schools, about the resources and the opportunities kids are having there, not just some test scores and outcomes. And I think we need a really good, informed public conversations on and on and on.
Well, so happy to be able to do that with you ladies today. Thank you for joining us on the show.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
And that is the agenda for Tuesday, February 25th, 2025. Tomorrow on the show, if our post-secondary education system is in crisis, what do the parties plan to do about it? Thanks for watching TVO. I'm Molly Thomas filling in for Steve Paikin. You can catch us, of course, anytime online at TVO.org. We will see you tomorrow.
We are where you are. TVO's current affairs journalism is available across platforms across Ontario, on Roku, Amazon Fire, Apple TV, and more. Catch The Agenda, The Thread, On Polly, and other podcasts, docs, and video series on the device of your choice when you choose.